Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing story of Pensacola, North America's first place city. Today we begin the story of Pensacola and the war between the states, a tragic time in American history, and yet one in which Pensacola itself played in the forefront for a number of months at the very beginning of the war. Of course, to tell the story, we have to go back and review just a little bit. Beginning with 1820, the three major issues began to cover across the entire United States. These issues were the tariff, which of course the northeastern states preferred, the issue of slavery and whether or not it could be or where it could be extended into other states and territories, and finally the idea of states' rights, because as the first two issues began to come to the fore, several states along the Atlantic seaboard began to say if they had joined the Union voluntarily in 1879 or 1789, then of course they could withdraw voluntarily as well, and of course many others opposed that. Well, things proceeded beautifully across the South here. Pensacola itself enjoyed a wonderful period from 1821 forward when we became part of the United States. The Navy Yard itself was built, the forts to protect it were constructed, and the Navy Yard itself prospered to a certain degree. But then beginning in the 1850s, these three issues began to fester once more. We saw problems in 1850 in such places as Kansas, Nebraska, Missouri, and then of course the problem festered even more when we came to 1858, when the issue of slavery itself became a paramount one in the Illinois senatorial election, which of course was reviewed. It was on, if we had had CNN or email at that time, that would have been the hottest news issue of the time. And of course the results of that issue, of that election, in which Mr. Lincoln's positions were very clearly stated, caused our own governor, Madison Perry, to say, well, trouble may be coming. And it was at that point that he chose to proceed with the development of a state militia, which is something Florida had not had before. And for this region, he appointed Colonel William Chase, the fort builder, to be the commanding officer. Meanwhile, of course, Colonel Chase was very actively at work building the first permanent, the first actual working railroad that Pensacola would enjoy. Work had begun on this back in 1853. By 1856, construction had begun, and by late 1858, they were well advanced on the construction of the line between the docks at Pensacola up to what was then called Pollard Junction, just over the Alabama line. This entire subject area began to fester even further in the 1858-59 area, spurred on, of course, by the abolitionist movement, Harriet Beecher Stowe and people of that kind. And then, of course, the great headline maker of that particular year was John Brown and his raid, which culminated at Harper's Ferry in Virginia, and again raised national issues, people focusing on what could happen if the states indeed did come into conflict. Well, all of this did climax, of course, finally in the election of 1860, when Mr. Lincoln, with the new Republican Party, bested three Democratic candidates. There were three of them all together: Mr. Douglas, Mr. Breckinridge, Mr. Bell, and of course, while Mr. Lincoln did not have an electoral majority, he did have an electoral college majority, and so by late on election night in November 1860, it was obvious that the Republicans and Mr. Lincoln had won, and that things were going to change. And it was at this point that action began, especially in two states. Number one was South Carolina, followed shortly by the legislature in Mississippi. And within the next 4 weeks, both of those states had seceded from the Union. At this point, Governor Perry said, well, it is time for Florida to take action. Many of our senior officials believe that we too should withdraw from the Union. And so Mr. Perry called the legislature into session in Tallahassee for January the 3rd, 1861. They were delayed because of storms and so forth, and consequently the following day, when they finally did convene, they decided to have a day of fasting and prayer, and then finally they went into session, and the ordinance of secession was put on the table. The discussions went on for about 8 days. It was a well-debated affair. Some of the older statesmen from Florida, including David Yulee and also William P. Duval, were definitely against withdrawal from the Union. But in the final accounting, the count in the legislature was 62 in favor of withdrawal, of secession, and 7 against. As all of this was taking place, Governor Perry activated the militia. And on the 6th of January, the first action was taken, and on January the 7th, still others in places like Fort Clinch and the Mariana Arsenal and the Chattahoochee Arsenal were captured. And Mr. Chase, Colonel Chase, was ordered to bring his militia into action. And by the 10th, by January the 10th, the militia had gathered here at Pensacola. Now there were about 600 of them, many of them from this immediate region, but about 250 of them had come from Alabama under a man named Tenant Lomax, Colonel Tenant Lomax. And he joined together with Chase, bringing this group together. You kind of have to use your imagination today. These men were gathered in the squares that we call today Ferdinand Plaza and Seville Square. They set up their campfires. They began the regular drill, because both of these officers were determined that these men were going to be well trained. They were going to be disciplined before they took any action, because at this point in time, the action to actually secede had not been drawn on the books, and Mr. Chase had not been given orders yet to proceed with his actions. But on the night of the 10th of January, here's where things stood. The communications began to come forth. Number one, the legislature in Tallahassee had proceeded. The secession papers had been drawn and they had been signed, and they had decided that since there was no other country to which they could affix themselves as that for the time being Florida would be divided in half, much as it had been back in Spanish and British times, and we would, over on this end of the Panhandle, we would be called West Florida, and we came into being then, and we would be for about 6 weeks. We became the Republic of West Florida with our own flag. Well, meanwhile, down in the square, the drilling went forward, and on the night of the 10th, by late afternoon, it was chilly, and the young men, most of them just off the farm, were there sitting around the campfire having a good time together. But they had not enjoyed drilling. Any man who had been early on in his basic training in whatever branch of the service can understand how that might be. They just had not enjoyed walking around. Some of them were not particularly used to wearing shoes, and this bothered them. And they were around the campfire that night, and a couple of them began to talk to each other. They said, "Now, what do we know about what's going on out there at the Navy Yard and at the forts?" "Well, we know, first of all, that the Fort Pickens is vacant. Nobody's there. Secondly, Fort McRae, as far as we know, there's a caretaker and his wife. That's all that's there. The Navy Yard itself has about 65 men there. Half of them are civilian workers in the yard. The other half are soldiers and Marines. And in Fort Barrancas, there are, again, about 65 men. They are all Coast Artillery. And we heard, this is the rumor today, but we heard that their two principal officers are gone. They've heard what's going on about secession law. They're Southern boys, and they didn't want to be a part of that, so they asked for leave and they were gone. And so the force in Fort Barrancas is about 65 men, led by a New York lieutenant by the name of Adam Slemmer. Well, the boys around the campfire said, we could stop all this right now. We wouldn't have to drill tomorrow. Why don't we get about 15 or 20 of us together? We'll take our muskets and our swords. We'll light some torches to light our way. We'll go out there. 20 good Southern boys can take care of 65 Yankees without any trouble at all. What do you say?" Well, some of the boys had reservations about that. What'll the colonel say if we do that? Right? Do you think that that's the thing to do? "Well, are you afeard?" Well, that did it right then. If somebody challenged the other man's bravery, and of course, all these young Southern boys had a kind of a cavalier, militaristic attitude toward this thing. They were sure that the South could overcome any obstacle, and so these 20 men or thereabouts put themselves together, and they marched from downtown Pensacola out toward Fort Barrancas. Now, Fort Barrancas has a sort of a trench, a ditch, a moat around it, and there's a little bridge that one has to cross to get into it. And so on the night we're talking about, at about 11 o'clock, the corporal of the guard is there along with 2 others, and after a time, about 11:30, they see these bobbing lights coming at them. They can't imagine what is going on, so they call the officer of the day, and he said, well, I don't know what it is, but when they get here, we'll just challenge them, but meanwhile, you better load your muskets. Well, about 2 or 3 minutes later, sure enough, Billy Joe and his friends arrive there, and the corporal of the guard sings out the proper command, halt, stop and be recognized, come forward with the password. And at this point, our friend Billy Joe out there, the man who had started all this, said, well, we have come here to take this here fort, and you better give up right now. And at that point, one of the 20 boys, we'll never know who it was, had his musket go off. Whether he fired it, whether it was an accident, we don't know. But it did happen. One of the men who was there that day, a man by the name L.W. Sweetman, wrote a little paper on it, just a few months later, and that has survived, and that, of course, is part of the record that we have of that particular event. Well, when that one musket was fired, the corporal of the guard was ordered to prime his musket and to fire on command over the heads of these 20 boys out there on the bridge. And they did. As soon as those two muskets fired, Billy Joe and his friends took off like 20 scared rabbits and rushed away. But you want to remember, this is now, we're talking about the 10th day of January, 1861. Shots were fired on both sides. Then that is roughly 3 months before other firing took place in this war. Well, of course, nothing further happened that night, except that Adam Slemmer realized that this was not the place to keep his people. And so early in the morning, Slemmer, with his 65 men, quickly moved out of Fort Barrancas, moved across the Narrows in small boats, and occupied Fort Pickens, which had been standing there basically unused for more than 20 years. And they scurried around, reconditioning the fort, trying to clean up the guns and so forth. And they were just preparing their defense. Okay, early in the next morning, here comes Colonel Chase. He has his 600 men lined up now. They march from downtown Pensacola to the Pensacola Navy Yard, which is under the command at this point by a Captain James Armstrong. Now, why Captain Armstrong had made no provision to defend this place, we don't know, but he did not. And there was a knock on the door. The 3 commissioners from the city council who accompanied Colonel Chase moved in, say, "We are here, sir, to demand the surrender of this fortification, this Navy Yard, on behalf of the Republic of West Florida." James Armstrong made no provision to defend it at all. He immediately capitulated. At this point in time, he ordered the quartermaster to send one man forward to draw down the American flag. And the quartermaster, this enlisted man, drew back his shoulders and said, "Sir, I am a loyal soldier, but that is one command I will not obey." So the commander, Mr. Armstrong, Captain Armstrong, turned to one of the civilian workers who did go forth and draw down the American flag, after which Colonel Chase sent one of his men forward with the new Republic of West Florida flag, which was raised, and now that group had command of the Navy Yard. Immediately, Captain Chase then took his aide and 2 others. They went to the Narrows, got a small boat, rowed across to Fort Pickens, where they approached the gate and knocked on it and demanded of Lieutenant Slemmer that this fort also be surrendered. And Mr. Slemmer, of course, knew very well who Chase was, knew that he had built the fort, knew every brick and bit of mortar in there. And Slemmer said, "Sir, I will not surrender. And you know as well as I do that if you take any overt action here, you may very well precipitate a terrible war, and I don't think you want to take that risk." And indeed, Chase withdrew. Now, in the next half a dozen days, 2 other attempts were made of a similar character with exactly the same result. Chase returned to downtown Pensacola and immediately sent wires off, first of all, to Governor Perry, and then to Washington to Senator Mallory, to advise what had happened here at Pensacola, that Fort Barrancas now was in their hands, that Fort McRae was in their hands, the Navy Yard, but that Fort Pickens was not. And the question was, what should we do next? Should an overt attack be made, because that fort was critical to the use of Pensacola as a passage for supplies coming into aid either the Republic of West Florida, or should this be necessary for a new southern state? And basically, that's the way things stood for the next week and a half. And at that point in time, communication went forward still further between Senator Mallory and President Buchanan, and we'll talk about that next time.